Hello, everyone. It is a pleasure for me to be here today to welcome you to this panel that the Africa Center has put together called African Immigrants and Their American Children, a discussion on race and identity. My name is Lupita Nyong'o, and I moved here to the US back in 2003. That means I've been here for 17 years. And in that time, I have grown, of course, more familiar with America, but I still find myself learning more and more about this country that does have in it quite a cultural diversity. And so, how I came to be introducing this particular subject is as follows. My first cousin moved to the US right before lockdown, I want to say about 3-4 weeks before lockdown. And she has 3 children, 2 of them are 5, and one is 7 years old. And so she moved here, and you can imagine coming to a new country, there's a lot of adjusting to do. And then no sooner had she arrived, lockdown happened. She had to pull her children out of school in Arizona and go through this cultural adjustment, more or less in isolation. That was hard enough. But then fast forward about 3 months later, George Floyd is killed before our eyes. And we all go through collective grief, confusion, anger. And for those of us who have been here before and longer, it was not new, but there was something about that incident that was just so brutal and bare, and that just shifted the consciousness, the urgency, everything just was at a boil. And I think it's got also a lot to do with the fact that we were all at home. And seeing this happen before our eyes with very little to distract us. But for my cousin, she now was speaking to her children about race, something that growing up in Kenya and surrounded by predominantly Black society, race is not the primary identifier. You have ethnicity, you have gender, you have wealth and class, but race is not at the tip of our tongues. And here she was trying to protect and educate her children in a totally new environment. And she sent me this text. She said, "It is painful. I think I'm still numb and in denial as I raise 2 Black men. I don't know what conversations to have with them and when." And she also said, their confidence and zeal, I do my best to nurture and protect that. How do I tell my 7-year-old son, some people may not like you because you are Black? That hurts to even just type. And so in response, I said to her, you never tell your 7-year-old son that. What you tell him is what is closer to the truth. Some people may not like you because they are white. Your son must never lose his dignity over their lack of it. But I also promised her that I would try and find resources to share with her about how to talk to her son and her sons and her daughter about race and that identifier. And then I thought to myself, where do I even begin? And I remembered the Africa Center and the fact that I am a member of the board, and this institution is one that is interested in unifying the experiences of Africans on the continent and in the diaspora. And I thought, wow, this is the perfect venue to have this conversation, to help people like my cousin who may not have racial identity as their first DNA, you know, as the first place they go to. They may not have the vocabulary and the automatic thinking that comes with being raised off this soil, and while they raise children on this soil. So I thought, this was a great place to have this conversation, to bring the community together, to have the conversation to equip parents to better serve their children who are ostensibly African American. And so I'm very happy to be here having this conversation. And what we're going to have is this is a small effort to help to address this issue, and hopefully it can inspire other efforts of this nature, and perhaps build an online resource that parents can go to just begin talking about this. So hopefully this equips you. This conversation will offer an exchange of experiences, resources, and expert advice from both first-generation Americans and African immigrants on how parents of African descent can initiate conversations about race, racism, anti-racism, identity, police brutality, and colorism with their children. And I hope you enjoy it. I am thrilled to have the talented and warm as sunset Somi Kakoma moderating the discussion. Somi is a Grammy-nominated vocalist and writer who was born in Illinois to immigrants from Uganda and Rwanda. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Somi.
Thank you so much, Lupita. Good morning. Thank you for that warm introduction and just giving some personal context to this conversation. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you might be joining us from. I'm super excited to be moderating this discussion. And I can't wait to get into this exchange with a wonderful kind of range of scholars and just people who are going to have, just have so much to contribute to this larger conversation that I think a lot of us are often wrestling with as African people in the world. I'd also like to please ask all of you who are gathering with us today to participate in the 2 poll questions that the Africa Center has put together to hear from you. One will go up now, and I believe the next one as we wrap up the conversation during an audience Q&A. So now I'd like to begin by introducing the speakers. Denique Boxhill, Associate Professional Clinical Counselor at Sankofa Holistic Counseling. Sorry, the questions are popping up on my screen too. Victor Ekpuk, a visual artist and father of 21-year-old son. Onoso Imoagene, an associate professor of social research and public policy at New York University, Abu Dhabi. Ifrah Udgoon, educator and mother of a teenage son. So firstly, I think I'll just give a little bit of context to my own interest in this conversation, just so that everybody's clear. The conversation is African immigrants and their American children, a discussion on race and identity. Welcome to our panelists. For me, my own interest in this conversation comes from the fact that I am a daughter of East African parents from Rwanda and Uganda, raised mostly in the Midwest. I've always had to navigate the politics of in-betweenness and transnationalism and sort of this liminal identity. So I've been raised with this keen sense of the notion that home is somewhere else, right? Not in this place, not in the United States. But that was how I was raised as a child. But over time and as an adult, and probably also in my parents' mind as well, home has shifted to be both here and there. And so that was a kind of that transition to understanding that home is, in both of these places. How do we reconcile that? So my journey also, I would say, as a professional artist and storyteller has actually given me the gift of being able to articulate my definition of home and identity through the imagination. And I find that to be incredibly freeing. So to me, this conversation is about championing nuanced constructions of Blackness and honoring the cultural heritage of Black immigrants that have undeniable impact on how we see the world and ourselves and how we move through the world. So I'll start that as just offering that anecdotal context in terms of why I even joined the conversation, why myself. I'm not a parent, but as a child of immigrants, and sort of how important this whole conversation has been about what is it to pass on a sense of self, really, and your cultural self to the next generation, and how that's also impacted my own personal life. So I'll start that by opening up the conversation and just saying, what does this conversation mean to each of you? And when you were invited to participate in this discussion, what prompted you to accept the invitation? The other thing I'll say before I point to someone is that this is a large question that we're asking. So we only have an hour or even under an hour to kind of address the conversation. So just understand these are touching stones, and it's going to feel, we're talking about kind of weighted things, very personal things, sometimes traumatic things. This is just a way of holding space for starting that conversation and raising questions more so than anything else. But with that, I'll just invite Ifrah, if you'd like to start by telling us, I'll just go through each one of you, telling us what this conversation means for you or to you, and what prompted you to accept the invitation.
Thank you so much, Somi. So my name is Ifrah Udgoon, and I'm originally from Somalia, and I do have a teenage son who has both Somali and African-American heritage. I accepted this invitation because I'm an African parent with an American child by birth, right? So he's got African-American heritage, but also by, circumstances, by being born in this country and living in this country and, formulating his thoughts and identities and ideas about the world right here in the United States. For me, discussing race had become very pertinent when Trayvon Martin was murdered. I remember that day, and I remember just that sinking feeling in my stomach, and just thinking to myself, it was a realization, and it was the beginning of my disenchantment with the United States. As much as I love this country, I also had to deal with the paradox that it was not kind and did not have a history of being kind to people who looked like myself and who looked like my son. And it was that moment that I realized, very much so, that I had to have this conversation with my son continuously in very sensitive ways, not to break his spirit, not to break his innocence, but to protect him so that he's not blindsided by racism, so that he's aware, but doesn't internalize it either, and doesn't tie it to his own sense of worth. This is a very important conversation to me. It's something that I continuously think about. And I'm really glad to be here with all of the other people and to share our thoughts. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Victor, if you might chime in with your perspective on why you joined this conversation.
So I got the invitation, and I nearly thought about it, because this is a very typical, actually the way that I am actually. I was born in Nigeria. I now have an adult son who was born here in the United States, and he's at that age where these are really the things that we're talking about: the killing of Trayvon Martin, and the shooting of young kids by police in the park, about his age mates when things were happening. And then George Floyd happened, and he's trying to help him navigate his identity first of all, and then all of these things that are happening, and making him be aware that yes, this country may not be kind to you, or was not kind to you because of the color of your skin, but it doesn't have to break your spirit. And you are still very proud. You should, retain your pride as a Black person, and be aware of your surrounding as well. And it's a huge burden to ask him to do, because all he wants to do as a kid, as a teenager, just want to go and have fun with his friends. And his friends are multi-ethnic friends. And I had to help him navigate that. And I thought that perhaps coming in here and sharing my perspective was the right thing. So I accepted to come and be part of this conversation.
Wonderful, thank you. Denique, would you mind just offering a word as well about why you chose to be a part of this conversation?
Sure, Somi, thank you. Hello, everyone. It was a no-brainer for me, honestly, Somi. It was my lived experience, continues to be. As an immigrant, it's just been an interesting journey to navigate two cultures. I'm an immigrant from Jamaica, where, like Lupita explained, the majority of the population is Black and of African ancestry. For me, so when I moved here for college at 15, I was moving into a very different Black experience, and I was young and impressionable, and those were some really formative years for me, and they really shaped me. And my father still lives in Jamaica, so I was figuring this out a lot on my own and in community with other peers who were immigrants. So for me, this conversation is powerful, and it's really critical to be curious in community with each other. To really pool our resources around navigating just the complexity of being from one world and existing in another. And also as a mental health clinician, I really ground myself in my commitment to the well-being of the children of my own ancestors. So I have these conversations in the therapeutic context as well with my clients. So I'm grateful for this space and to be here. So thank you so much for the invitation and for having me.
Thank you, Denique. Onoso, do you mind telling us why you accepted this invitation?
Hi, thanks, Somi. So also an immigrant. I'm from Nigeria, and I came to the United States as an adult. And I'm a sociologist by training and profession. And so my research interests, my particular areas are international migration and race and ethnicity. And I focus specifically on African immigrants and their children and their experiences in the diaspora. And so with my first book, I looked at the adult children of Nigerian immigrants in the United States and in Britain, really talking to them about their identity work from the time they were young to adulthood. And so this is my interest, really trying to understand how groups, different ethnic groups, different national groups from Africa and the Caribbean, how they actually integrate and assimilate once they come to majority white countries like the United States or Britain. So one of my core interests is understanding ethnicity among Blacks and how does that manifest. And so these are some questions I'm always fascinated about. And so just actually having this opportunity was wonderful to talk about African immigrants. I talk about their experiences and talk about their children's experiences, and particularly, what can we get from Black on Black interaction and Black on Black relations? How do these individuals interact with African Americans, and how in the US context and with Caribbeans in the UK context, and how does that shape their identity? So thank you so much for this invitation, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Wonderful. Well, welcome again to all of you. I just want to say quickly about the poll. Thanks to our audience for answering the poll. It seems as though almost 75% of those of us who are here are currently having these conversations with their children or parents about race, which means that this is an important conversation that we're having privately. It's also wonderful. I think in African spaces, sometimes these kind of, not necessarily, I won't call it taboo, but it is a bit of a touchy conversation, right? When you talk about race, it's a hot button. And I think oftentimes these definitions of Blackness, when we come from these predominantly Black cultures, we don't really have, or societies, we don't really have these conversations about race, because in some ways, we take it for granted. Yes, we take it for granted. So sorry, I'm getting like messages at the same time. So I will say that I'd love to speak directly to the two parents on this call, or the two that I know are parents. I'm sorry, I'll speak to you specifically about your parenting experience, Victor and Ifrah. Both of you, when I posed the question about why you are participating in this conversation, I find it interesting that you both spoke kind of from very recent events in terms of George Floyd. And I think that speaks to this kind of larger social, this larger societal awakening and conversation we're having in the public sphere about race and the Black Lives Matter movement and institutional racism, right? But I'm curious, about, you know, and Ifrah, you often speak about yourself as a perpetual foreigner, and Victor, your work is, your creative practice is deeply rooted in heritage. So I'm just curious, because clearly these are things that you've been holding, like how you like your sense of identity is something you've been holding on to in other ways prior to this past summer with George Floyd and all the events that have kind of come as a result of that devastating moment. I'm curious about whether you were having these conversations with your children prior to this moment, and if you ever felt as though if those conversations were instigated by intuition, or if it's specific to very, you know, public experiences that, you know, they're ingesting, they have to process on their own, or are those conversations instigated by questions from your children? So I'm just curious about like how you've navigated that, and if you don't mind sharing from a personal kind of experience.
Actually, before the big blow up of race issue in contemporary American history, as we've come to know, we've also lived as a family in Europe, in the Netherlands. Then my kid was where he started elementary school there. And if you know, in the Netherlands, they have the Black Peter phenomenon, the Zwarte Piet, where Dutch people paint their faces as, you know, gollywog and basically do stupid things to mimic, and that's supposed to be how children have fun around Christmas time. And I had to deal with that, and I had to explain to my son about that, even though as a kid, it was just what children did. And he wanted to participate, but he didn't have the understanding and the fuller implication of the meaning of that, of how the racial derogatory meaning of that symbol. I had to sit him down and explain to him. Maybe he didn't fully understand it then at the age of 5, 6, because to him it was just fun. That is what his teachers were telling him. We don't mean anything by it, it's just fun. But I had to tell him all the same, that they're making fun of you. They are telling you that you are less because of the color of your skin. I had to just say it. And, you know, I had to come into situations like that. And, you know, I just, earlier on, I had to bring him to that awareness to the extent that he could understand it. And then, you know, being at an international school, was probably one of the few Black kids in that school. Of course, his color always stands out. As I've come to learn later on that some of his friends were calling him names, Blackie, something like that. I didn't know, he didn't tell me back then. but you know, so those are some of the issues I had to prepare him for. And when we came back to the United States, this issue of identity coming in as what they call the third culture child, who is American by paper, but hasn't really fully experienced what being an American is. He was speaking Dutch and speaking English and was an American in the Netherlands, but when he came back to the United States, he found it difficult to fit in here because he was neither Black enough or American enough. So it was in that weird situation where he couldn't understand the slangs of the other Black kids in school, so they thought he was weird. And his white friends regarded him as Black, so he should be on the other side. So, you know, those kind of situations, and these things come home sometimes, and I have to explain that, look, this is where you are. And eventually, you know, he started growing into getting used to those things. So before these things happened, I had always hinted him that he should always hold his head up, because people will always see him as different, and he should know that and prepare for that. So it wasn't a conversation that I never used to have with him.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Ifrah, do you mind weighing in on what your experience has been so far? And
yes, absolutely.
By the current events, or if you were having those conversations prior to.
Thank you very much. So my son right now, he's 13 years old. And when Trayvon Martin was murdered, he was about 5 years old. At that moment, you know, in contemporary American society, Black boys are still seen, you know, as cute and non-threatening. But when Trayvon Martin was killed, I knew that that he was going to grow up. I mean, you know, as a parent and as a human being, a chronological age, that your child will grow up. But there was a lot of urgency and immediacy within me at that moment to really talk about race. Before that, I would talk about, you know, differences and how people are different and we respect everyone and, you know, we're all one people, et cetera, because I truly believe that myself as well. And it was also my own awakening at that time, my own realization of my position in the United States. I came here as an immigrant. I was 12 years old. As a, you know, young child, you really just kind of want to fit in. You don't really want to draw too much attention to yourself. And I had friends of, you know, all ethnicities. And that was the kind of person really that I wanted to be. And I think I purposely, maybe was in denial, just kind of ignored the reality. And I think that's also something that we do. In realizing that about myself, I thought that my son might inadvertently internalize some things. We lived in Kentucky. We live now in Ohio where there's more diversity, but we lived in Kentucky. And as he was growing up, I thought to myself, I can't continue living here. I can't raise my child here. I can't have my Black boy, you know, going to high school here in what I say a sea of whiteness and not see himself reflected back and always question where he belongs. In terms of what Victor also says, having these conversations were really difficult for me. Because I don't think I had an accurate understanding myself. And I also wanted to just avoid it. But because of what was happening in the society that I lived in, I had to confront it and I had to talk about it. And I felt that I was betraying my child. I felt that I was the one, you know, taking his innocence and, you know, making him feel different. And then I had to live and sit with that because I knew it wasn't me. I just had to prepare him. I had to make him aware. When this summer, George Floyd was murdered, was another, you know, many things had happened in between, but it was another really low moment for me because now my child, he's 13, he's really tall, you know, he's mistaken for a 15-year-old, he's really coming into his features. And I have this realization that, you know, I need to have more of these conversations with him. And now we need to talk about real American history. And we need to really talk about the way our society is set up. It's heartbreaking because at 13, you have other concerns. You're adolescent, you're going through puberty, you're, you know, trying to find your place and who you fit in. And you don't really want to talk about something else that makes you different or that points you out or makes people put attention on you. But these conversations they have to be had. And I want to throw up sometimes, you know, just telling him about the reality of the matter, reality of the history in this country, the way Black people are treated. And hopefully, and tell him and remind him that don't internalize that. It's not true, right? Just because they say it's true doesn't mean it's true. And, you know, hold your head up high always. But that's the situation basically that I'm in, and I imagine many Black parents are in.
Thank you. I think my other, I appreciate both of you for that very personal point of view. I'm also, just to be clear, do you feel as though this particular moment right now in this country's kind of this sort of social reckoning, this political discourse around race, do you feel like it's pushing you forward, like you don't have a choice to talk about it? Do you feel like you'd rather talk about it directly, or is it something that you'd rather it come from you as opposed to like the media telling them what the Black experience is?
Absolutely. I would say I definitely would want it to come from me and from other people in our family and amongst our friends. Kids nowadays, you know, they're all on the internet, they're on social media, although, you know, I'm still putting that off and still trying to, you know, control that aspect and that influence, but they get the information somehow, some way. And I think it's better that it comes from a parent or an educator or somebody who deeply cares about them and their experience, rather than the little, you know, snippets in our media, which is very, very biased.
I feel that it was coming from me, at least when he was young and couldn't quite understand what was going on, was for me a better choice than having to let him find it out by himself, because sometimes he could just find out the wrong things. That said, what I was putting out was more of a balanced situation. Yes, we have these issues with race, and I refer him to history. I just exposed him to American history earlier on, but I also pointed out to him that in spite of all of this, look at the successes that Black people have made. Mm-hmm. And you should look at that and see that in spite of all of this, you can also make opportunity for yourself. You don't have to fall back in the victim mode because you're Black. Look at all these people. I mean, I guess being an immigrant, you're coming from a lot of adversity to a place that even though it's ugly sometimes, but you find some space where you could blossom. And that is sort of what I believe I've imparted to him, that in spite of all the negativity, there is space for you to be who you are and have your voice heard and succeed.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. I think really honing in on the idea of the immigrant's experience being so kind of nuanced and different, is a wonderful way to segue into to opening up the conversation with Denique and Onoso. There's a lot of literature around how the Black immigrant experience is often decentralized from conversations in this country around immigration policy and narratives and just experiences in general, right? We oftentimes speak about our Latino brothers and sisters and we don't really, that's usually what's centralized in the conversation around immigration policy in the United States. And so it's super important, I believe, to hold space for the Black immigrant lens and point of view. Based on your professional experience, what does research tell us about the experiences and challenges that African, Caribbean, and other Black immigrants face when it comes to talking to their children about race? And how is this relevant to African parents and their children who are growing up currently in the United States? Denique, if you want to start, I can, pass it to you.
Sure, Somi, sure. There's research on racial identity development and the stages of awareness that we tend to move through. And we come to those conversations based on our level of awareness, both as parents, as caregivers, and also as the children, the recipient of the information, whether or not you really have a frame of reference. Is this conversation, does it feel arbitrary in your lived experience, depending on your age, the age appropriateness of the conversation as well. So the challenge is, I really appreciate hearing from Victor and Ifrah directly about this, because the prompts will be different for the conversation as well. Sometimes the prompts, it's born out of circumstances. You have no choice but to have the conversation. The opportunity is almost taken from you. So you don't really get the chance to really ease into this conversation and control the narrative around how you introduce your kids to race and at what age, how you talk about difference. So just saying all that to say that it's, parents come from, the underlying need is to keep your children safe, to want to protect them. And sometimes the response can be really an emotional response. So the challenge then becomes, how do you have a conversation that it's coming from a place of fear, even though the real need is to keep your children safe. So when Ifrah talks about worrying that her child will internalize her own fears and her own apprehension about talking about this and this lived experience that she's having, knowing that children may be having a very different experience or not yet, you're trying to prepare them almost for a world that they may not yet have an awareness of. So it's mixed, and it's a mixed bag of emotions. So really just kind of leaning into your own self-awareness, your own self-compassion, and pacing yourself in this conversation is really, really critical, so that you can control the narrative. And exactly what you said, you're not being informed about who you are from the media, from other people, and also digesting the biases that come with that.
Thank you for that. Onoso, would you like to weigh in on that as well?
Yeah, that's, talking to the children of Nigerian immigrants in the United States, and even subsequent conversations I've had have revealed such fascinating things. I think one of the first things when you look at research, both mine and also other research out there, Mary Waters and co, is that who looked at Caribbean immigrants, there's been some distancing when they talk about how sometimes African immigrants and Caribbean immigrants try to distance themselves from African Americans particularly because many of them have imbibed a lot of the negative stereotypes that were around African Americans. So sometimes that carries over to how they talk to their children. They make a lot of class distinctions. Don't move with this kind of people, move with this particular group of individuals. You have a lot of parents who are worried that their children shouldn't become too Americanized. So I have one of my respondents who told me, actually quite a number of them who told me, when we were growing up, our parents would tell them things like, outside there you're in America, but once you come into our house and the door is closed, you're in Nigeria. So we're actually pushing, so you might have all that going out there, but look, we're going to operate with a different system once you're in the house. And you have some of those tensions going on in terms of the experiences. But then again, another complicating factor is that a lot of the African immigrants, or the second generation, those who grew up in the US when they were young, talked about having tensions with African Americans, right? Because they felt that, these should be our natural allies. They're Black like we are. We should be friends. And they were being told things like, you're a different kind of Black, right? And so there's this common term that so many of my respondents all over the United States had directed at them, the term African booty scratcher. I don't know if some of you have heard that term, right? Where it's like, you're African, you're, making allusions to being from an uncivilized area and a jungle area. So these were some of the tensions on the ground as these young Africans who are growing up in the US context. In the British context was quite similar, where Caribbeans were telling them, you're an African boo-boo. So African boo-boo, African booty scratcher, in two national contexts referring to some of these things. So these are some of, why, we have to really see how all these groups, how diversity among Black people is playing out on the ground. But I think when you also talk about the experiences outside of, the worries that African immigrant parents will have and the tensions their own children have experienced that make them begin to question what does it mean to be Black, right? Is that also these children are growing up in a transnational definition of Blackness, right? Even if their parents don't necessarily take them back home for visits, back to their country of origin for visits, they tend to be embedded in transnational social fields. By that I mean, their parents tend to have a lot of immigrant parents. If they're doing Thanksgiving, they might have the turkey, but they have the local foods, the jollof rice and the pounded yam and the wolof and check different foods. So they're always constantly blending, and they have cousins back home that they are Zooming, not before Zoom, WhatsApp or Facebook. So they're growing up in these transnational fields where they're straddling two worlds. And I think, that sometimes it's an advantage to be able to draw from those two cultures, and parents are trying to make them culturally competent in both their own ethnic culture, their national culture, and also saying, you have to learn the system in the US and how to survive in the system. And we find that gives some advantages to children of immigrants, the ability to straddle those two worlds and pull from the cultures of those two worlds and the values and form their own unique sense of identity and how they can navigate. So I think that's one of the things I would say, that children of African immigrants and also children of other immigrants are having a richer, a fuller sense of what it means to be Black. Not just that you're Black or you're African American, but you're also Nigerian or Ghanaian or Ethiopian, and you're also African or Caribbean, and that's something really, really helpful.
Right. Thank you so much. Are there any consequences that either of you can speak about in terms of not? I think we can all agree on the benefits of speaking about race and the benefit of championing culture and Black identity in the young people, in the younger generation. But are there any consequences that you might just want to raise of not being proactive about these conversations, and or if you want to just say from a point of view of are there any resources that we might be able to point people to tap into in the event they don't have the language or they're not sure how to broach these conversations with their children? And also, Denique, if you want to take that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Somi. Absolutely. And I think the consequences are, it's kind of a flip of what you highlighted. We know why we do it and why it's important to do it. To other people will tell you who you are otherwise. And so the way that Victor explained that, just talking with his son, I really appreciate that. So you get to really center what it means to be Black, what it means to be an immigrant, what it means to be African, and your ancestry. You get to celebrate the art, the just kind of the all the joy that comes with being Black and being an immigrant, being African. And so when you don't get that chance, or you don't have that conversation, those conversations are being had in a social context in different ways, and you end up kind of ingesting different kinds of messages about a Black experience that may not be your truth, or the truth of your origin. So getting ahead of, I think, of any narrative is really critical to really distill into the truth. And it's really important to talk about how to do that exactly. So they're great books. One that a friend of mine really centers and in her own care for her child is Parenting for Liberation, and it kind of just makes that distinction of, you can lead the conversation talking about social injustice, racial injustice, also important. And then you can also make a whole lot of space for celebration, getting to know your roots, your history, where you come from, whose shoulders you stand on, really just centering in that. And there are books that really span developmental ages, 0 to 3. You start, showing images, and there are other Center for Racial Justice and Education. I imagine maybe we'll put together some kind of resource that people can access through the Africa Center. So I'm happy to share additional ones about that. And then also just psychological safety, establishing that. There's some tools through the American Psychological Association, the Association of Black Psychologists, just providing language, again, to approach that conversation, to celebrate Blackness versus kind of the antithesis of that.
Yeah, yeah. I think Denique has really touched upon, the importance of messages of pride in being Black and pride in where you're coming from. It's really so important. And all these really, I think one of the things you're talking about, consequences, is that it's really important to have these conversations. And the term we tend to talk about is racial and ethnic socialization. It really, parents have to become intentional about these things, because as Victor and Ifrah and Denique have talked about, if you don't, they're picking up so many messages from the media and so much going on around them. And the consequences are really very clear when you look at research coming, especially from the psychologists. It's that children who are given racial socialization by parents tend to be well adjusted, better adjusted. They have less exhibition of racial stress if they are being prepared, right? So what the research shows is that if it might be that, okay, I'm silent about this topic, but it doesn't prepare them for when they encounter racial injustice, and you haven't taught them about the skills on how to navigate those tensions and how to come out of it well. And Ifrah mentioned it, Victor also mentioned it about, you have to mediate. As a parent, you have that authority at a particular time to mediate the negative messages and stereotypes that are coming about people of color, and that helps your child have a positive sense of identity. That really strengthens them, right? And so once you do that, they don't internalize and take on board and take upon themselves those negative perceptions of people of color. So these are some of the real protective functions of actually talking to your children about race. It helps them manage stressful situations. So we can't, sometimes African parents tend to be silent about this, or, a lot of their racial socialization is unintentional, just as side comments, or they don't talk about it, or they're like, oh, we're in a colorblind society, just work very hard. And if you work hard, you will succeed, which are good messages, right? But you also have to add on to the fact that they should be prepared, that there are racial inequalities in society, and that prepares them. You know, and so I think all what Denique said is really on point. Messages of racial pride, ethnic pride, national pride are all important, along with preparing them about the inequalities that exist in the United States. I will add, as within the community, that even taking your children back home for a vacation is so important. It really is such a critical event in the mind of these children, because you're offering them, you know, real life examples and of new versions and definitions of blackness, other black people. This is who you are. And many of them in my survey talk about how it was so liberating to go back home and, you know, see what it was like, talk to cousins, peers, and it made them better prepared to handle the whole challenge of African Americans telling them, hey, wait a minute, you're not like us or something. It allowed them to have vocabulary for a definition of blackness that was more relevant to their own lived experience as children of immigrants.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, both of you. Those, I think what's important to note is the African Center will provide a list of resources. We can gather those from the ones that Denique mentioned and any others that the panelists might want to weigh in on. Ifrah and Victor, did either of you, do you feel as though you relied on sort of formal resources or any of these things that Onoso also raised? I mean, I think from a personal experience, definitely the fact that my family always kind of came from this championing of an Africanist point of view. And I did have that experience of like, when you're in the house, it's an African house, you know, when you're outside, it's a different thing. And so, you know, but I know that having the opportunity to go home, and as I said, home for us was always across the waters, you know, even if Illinois had been home for as long as I had known. You know, the idea of always having that connection with home and having the opportunity to travel really informed my sense of self. And, you know, and this other Black, excuse me, this other Black experience that you mentioned on also. I'm curious to both Victor and Ifrah, and I think I'll also just say that I think we're gonna go a few minutes longer, if that's okay with everybody, another extra 10 or 15 minutes, just to let people at home know as well. But we can start letting people, you know, ask questions in the Q&A, and then they'll be filtered into our conversation from the audience. Ifrah and Victor, I'm curious if you've had that, is it a conversation about other Black, I know both of you have partners who are American. I mean, do you feel as though you have to kind of talk about that? And by American, I just mean like coming from an African-American, you know, generational history, you know. So do you feel as though you have to have that conversation where you separate the idea of Blackness as a Somali American or a Nigerian American, you know? Do you feel as though you had to have that conversation? Because I too went through all of those things you were talking about, and also people saying African booty scratcher, people asking if we lived in trees, people just like the ignorance that shows up from, you know, Black people and, you know, all kinds of people. And you know, I remember having educators ask me these kind of questions, my own teachers in class asking me these kind of questions. So how do you confront that level of ignorance about African identity in this country? And do you feel as though you have to make that distinction? Is that helpful, or does it get in the way of a Pan-Africanist kind of ideology and like a really global Black identity?
Okay, can I take it? Okay, so I've always, even when I was living in Nigeria, I grew up believing, especially through college, believing in the idea of Pan-Africanism and all that. So I always just believe that, you know, the African struggle is a global struggle for all of us. And so coming to the United States, I didn't think differently. I saw well, first of all, I'm married to an African-American woman. That means that her parents and grandparents, as far as she can remember, were born in this country. So I've had all the experience of that most African-Americans have had. So that's that. And I was born in Nigeria. I've not had some of the experience that, you know, she's had. So when we raise our son together, I guess these two ideas come together in how we teach him about the world, both from his mother's side and from my side. So these, especially when we came back to the United States, that notion of what it is to be an American became even much more than anywhere else that we've lived, because he's coming to experience what that really means. That means he has to navigate between his white friends and his Black friends. He started playing basketball in high school. So that's, in high school is when these things started to play out. And in a way, he started to negotiate these friendships. I mean, it's still very, we live in a suburb which is, mostly white, but he started to negotiate the positions that how he positions his Black friends and his white friends. Sometimes they come together, sometimes they don't. He spends sleepovers in different places, and that's how he was able to negotiate this new world that is Americanness, so to speak. And I think, we're talking about taking the kids home. I think it was at the age of 17, I did take him back to Nigeria. The very first time he experienced Nigeria, at least on the news, was he was watching something in the National Geography, and they were talking about the World Wildlife Foundation in southeastern Nigeria, where they have a reservation for gorillas. And then in that documentary, it shows that an airplane with a Black pilot landed in an airport in Calabar in southeastern Nigeria. And he turned to me and said, "Is that Nigeria?" I said, "Yes." I said, "Why did you ask?" He said, "Well, they have an airplane. And they have Black people, there's a Black person who is the pilot. And all of the staff were all, Africans." So that's when it occurred to me, oh, this is, they don't teach you this at school. When they talk about Africa, the image of Africa is a hut and a giraffe. That is a symbol for Africa. So now for him to see this, I said, okay, so fine. Now I started showing him photographs of Lagos and the different cities in Nigeria and said, no, forget that all the things that you were taught. This is what Nigeria is. So when I took him home and we flew out, and I had to prepare him. So first of all, we're going to land in Lagos. And I had, was hosted by a wealthy host where we lived nice. And I told him that first of all, you're going to have electricity 24/7. You're going to live almost like you're living in the United States with all the comforts, okay? Then when we're going to leave and go to the south, to the east, home, and then you're going to experience, it's going to be a different experience. And then we got there, I said, well, we didn't have power 24/7, we had power to sleep, and then he was cut off from the internet, right? Because I bought him a dumb phone and said, yeah, your smartphone is no longer useful here because we can't afford to buy data. So I bought him a dumb phone. This is for if you need to communicate with me. So for about 2 or 3 weeks, he had he had no communication with any of his friends. Mm. And is I wondering what happened to him? And then he was just there, no internet. And then he picked up an old guitar that, gave him guitar lessons when he was younger. Picked up my friend's guitar, brushed it up and started playing it and started to be with himself. And, he got to see the larger family. I said, this is your extended family. So in case of whatever anybody else tells you, this is your extended family, this is your roots. I mean, I took him to where my great-grandfather started my village. I said, that there's a tree that when a son moves out of his parents and go to start his own community, he plants this tree. So this tree is dead, but the stump is still standing at the village square. So I told him, turn here and take a picture. This is literally your family tree. Mm. This is where you come from. So your only son, you only see myself and your mom and me. This extends as far as you can go. And you walk down this street was, it was initially only members of your family that lived on the streets, So that gives him a much larger perspective of himself. So in terms of talking about the pride that the kids come, so you move into the world knowing that you are beyond whatever anybody is trying to put you down. And that's always what I've always tried to, to instill in him. So when he encounters these issues, sometimes he just brushes it aside. I mean, it could hurt, but sometimes he just brushes it aside because of their ignorance, you know? So these are some of the ways that I believe that I had tried to instill in him, and that it resonates even as he's become an adult and how he's now using to navigate the world that he is in, and so on. Even when he meets ignorance, he will always know that, well, they're coming from a point of not knowing. Somebody have actually asked me once that, look, you're not Black. This is coming from an African-American person. And I said, well, I rubbed my skin. I said, you didn't go off. What are you talking about? You know, but at the end of the day, it's just about the, you know, so in terms of Blackness, what does it really mean? Who defines who? You know, am I Black if, you know, I mean, African Americans might define Blackness in a different way, or some African Americans, not all, might define Blackness in a certain way. Others might have a more universal notion of Blackness. At some point, I think there's a time when Barack Obama, people were saying that Barack Obama wasn't Black enough. Well, that is that person's ignorance about Blackness. If Blackness means just being in a small, very myopic, small center of a certain small experience, rather than the Blackness that expands across the ocean and all of the things that that has to offer, for which the genetic, you know, the genetic memory of the Blackness from Africa is actually what defines the Blackness here. So people tend to just limit themselves to a small idea of Blackness. And that's what I try to, you know, let people know that, you know, you are beyond what you remember.
Beautiful, that's a beautiful, beyond what you remember, right? Because there's something so much larger and longer inside of us in terms of our lineage, our heritage. We can't always call forth, you know, but that we know is inside of us. And I think that is actually the definition of instilling pride in someone. I do want to get to a couple of these Q&A questions, but Ifrah, if you wanted to weigh in with a short
I have a short answer, Somi. So, and I agree with Victor in terms of, and everybody who said that, going back home, right? My son and I went to, we didn't go to Somalia, we went to Kenya. So, and I had spent some time in my youth in Kenya as well. And so Kenya in a way is home. So we went to Kenya, we went to Garissa, where I went to secondary school, we went to Nairobi, we went to Mombasa, and, you know, I really wanted him to see where I lived and where I went to school. We went to my old school. He got to experience, you know, being in a rural area where we didn't have a lot of modern amenities, like Victor mentioned. And my 10-year-old at that time was sort of, he likes to say traumatized. He's like, I'm not going back to there, but we're going to go back. You know, Corona messed it up for me this year, but we're going to go back. And if I have anything to do with it, my son will definitely, you know his African heritage. It's very important to me. He knows it's very important to me. You know, he knows our family, and he's kind of forgotten the language because I didn't do a good job of it. I kind of dropped the ball there. But in other ways, as much as I can introduce him to his heritage and that he can carry that with him, like Victor said, anywhere he goes, and he has grounding. That is my goal for him. So
beautiful. Thank you for that. I will just share something one of the audience members has sent in, saying the conversation is so good. Thank you. We are talking about talking to children, but who is talking to the African immigrant parents? The parents have one eye in Africa, sending money home, telling kids not to get caught up in the US, talking about retiring in Africa, but children of African immigrants want to fit in socially in school, etc. So I guess the question, it's a comment, but the question is really who is talking to African immigrant parents, but perhaps are there any resources, and also being given your research, are there any resources to African parents about navigating race themselves, you know, in a more personal way, not necessarily, because I think once they can understand it for themselves, then perhaps that will inform how they are able to talk to their children. So are there any resources that you might be able to offer in that regard?
No, I think I will have to look to Denique, who talks about maybe their age-appropriate resources for adults. But I think because, I think the thing with African immigrants is that the research just tells us that your ethnic identity tends to be very solid and well-formed when you're an adult. It really doesn't shift. Like, it's not in flux like it is for the children, right? So if you talk to someone who came in as an adult and they say, oh, I'm Nigerian, if you come back to them 30 years after in the United States, they'll say, oh, I'm Nigerian, right? It still stays the same, even if different events have sort of made them think about things differently. I think it depends on the social location or position of the parents. I think parents who are involved in ethnic associations, some of these ethnic associations are talking about these questions. It depends on the belief systems of the parents, if they are in some churches, transnational churches, if they are in transnational mosques. You have some of that going on in those places too, where there are conversations being had as parents talk to themselves about the challenges they have about raising children. Some professional organizations, some of the organizations about immigrants in the diaspora that are organized around certain national contexts of Nigerian or Ghanaian, they do have some of those resources. But I think, it's a tension that is occurring all the time between first generation and second generation parents, regardless of all races. It's not something that is unique to Africans, where the children of first generation immigrants, those who come into the US as adults, always feel that their parents are more strict. Their parents aren't as permissive as other parents. Hey, they don't allow us to sleep over, or they don't like, they have different views of dating. It cuts across all the races, but that's what's going on. But what I would say from my own research and talking to people within my own communities, I think some of these events that have been happening in the United States are really galvanizing or really making clear to African immigrant parents the entrenched nature of a lot of this racial discrimination. And one of the things I would say is that identities are fluid in one sense, in that in terms of conditions of racial discrimination or when you're in the workplace and you're being discriminated against, the awareness that we're all Black expands out, right? Because the external stimulus is discrimination. So at that point in time, even African immigrants begin to talk about racial discrimination against all Black people. Even if in their private conversations, they begin to make all these different distinctions. And then, when you're now talking to your own co-ethnic, you can contract your identity down to be like, okay, these are Ghanaians talking Ghanaian to Ghanaian, or this ethnic group to this ethnic group. So parents themselves are becoming more sensitized, and their children are helping them. So I think one of these resources is for their children to come back and tell them, look, this is what you're stressing, and this is my reality outside, right? This is what I'm seeing in school, and look, we have to find a way to deal with these tensions, and so you have that co-education going on. Mm-hmm. I would say.
I love that Onoso said that she didn't have the answer, but she actually offered a brilliant response. Thank you for that. I'm actually going to change the question for you, Denique. In your work, you talk a lot about, related to one of the questions from the audience. In your work, you talk a lot about co-creating culturally inclusive and trauma-informed spaces, spaces that are trauma and use a trauma-informed lens. And can you speak a little bit about what it is to navigate that trauma and the intersectional way of honoring our whole selves, right? And I think I'm raising this because one of the questions is from a first-generation North American US, well, I'll say second generation, based on what Onoso's book informed us of the other day. First generation, so somebody who was the first. I'm not sure. He says Mali, or he or she says Mali and Jamaican parents. So technically, according to the science that Onoso informed us of prior to this conversation on live, second generation is how most people in that space actually speak about those who have parents who were foreign born and they were raised in another country, which was informed, it was just new to me. I always identified as first generation. But the question is, how can we dismantle the trust in the diaspora. Continental Africans, West Indians are often taught and led to believe, that perhaps African Americans are not to be trusted, and vice versa, right? And sometimes African Americans have biases against non-US born African descent, folks who are of African descent. I've been seeing that there's a group called ADOS, African Descendants of Slaves, and there's really been a lot of pushback about who is able to kind of, let's say, reap the rewards of those who have long suffered in this country to gain certain civil rights or, certain economic and educational positions, So there's a whole conversation, just that intra-racial conflict. So I know I threw a bunch of it at you just now. The
good thing is that
cultural inclusivity, thinking about trauma, not only in the ways that we know of it here in the US, but like how the parallels to, post-colonial societies and how they inform perhaps the Blackness and how they might, again, dismantle that trust and bring more unity to a kind of global Black understanding and connection. Sorry, that's a lot.
The good thing, Somi, is that I'm a therapist, so I'm trained to follow all the places that you took me, and we're right back here again. I really appreciate the question, and it feels like the short answer is relationship and proximity to community. So when we think about dismantling distrust among the diaspora, I just really appreciate this question. I remember moving here at 15 and feeling this need to protect my cultural identity, and it didn't come from, for me then, it didn't feel like an anti-Black or anti-Black American or anti-anything. It felt like pro my cultural identity, and I really wanted to preserve and celebrate that. And then, I think just developing and becoming really steeped in American culture and trying to find my way through it, I started to really unpack, how does this matter? When I'm seen as a Black woman in America, no one's pausing before they discriminate against me to ask me where I'm from or my proximity to my Americanness or something like that. So relationship is what I think of. There's a lot of othering that tends to happen within the Black community. And when we think of the subjugated identities that we hold and the intersectional identities that we hold, what does your Blackness intersect with? Black and what? Black and disabled, Black and queer, Black and what's your immigration story? Are you here by choice? Was it a traumatic experience that led you here? So when you speak about trauma, Somi, I think of just how that is such a personal and subjective experience. So working with people through a trauma-informed lens and really making that space for people to narrate their own stories and give language and voice to things that may never have been told, and making sense of that and really processing so that idea of our whole self and giving ourselves permission to take up space and claim our whole selves. In doing that, we give others permission to do the same, and we connect. All we really want is belonging. I think it's a fundamental human need, a sense of belonging, a sense of community. So focusing on relationship and community building, we find where we are most aligned and where we're most common. And those are the things that I think tend to dismantle these social constructs that have been set up. There's this system alive that really keeps this rhetoric going. So where we can build awareness around that and give ourselves the permission to move toward, then just beautiful things start to happen within community and within relationship.
Wonderful, thank you so much for that. There's one last question. I mean, there's so many questions, unfortunately we can't get to all of them, but one last question is the conversation about African immigration now being rethought in terms of Afropolitan identity? In other words, it's not about one specific African nation and the US or even the UK, but all of these places, for people who might need context in terms of Afropolitan and the way that it was a term, I believe, was coined by Tai Selassie, a Ghanaian writer. And she's talking about kind of this, this experience of this multinational, kind of this transnational identity of, I think she's speaking more of like a very cosmopolitan, well-educated, frankly, whatever, educated in quotes, kind of African person who shows up in like major metropoles in the United States and in Europe, and how that kind of informs their identity and their sense of self as Africans, as kind of cosmopolitan people in the world. I think that the question is the conversation about African immigration now being rethought in terms of Afropolitan identity? Onoso, do you have anything you want to maybe weigh in on that? Because again, just to plug the book, which I believe is called Beyond Expectations, Second Generation Nigerians in United States and Britain, I believe it's called. Perhaps you can speak about that. I don't know, do you feel as though immigration is now being recontextualized to an Afropolitan lens?
I don't think so. I think one of the things sometimes we try to simplify identities, and that might not be the way to go. I think if you begin to talk to everybody's story is different, and the mechanisms that are operating in the different immigrant communities are sometimes unique to these immigrant communities, and it also, when you talk about Afropolitan, what are you adding into it? I think it might be interesting for people to go into different communities and see what identities people are using and how they are identifying and what they are putting forward, instead of trying to find a label that might be able to subsume all these differences. I think that's when we begin to, there might be pushback about that, because I mean, if you even talk about what is African or Africa, we already have a problem when we talk about African identity, because we're like, this is a continent of 54 countries, right, that are unique in themselves. There's diversity in this country. So even when you talk about Africa, we're like, what are you saying, right? And we have a problem too when you talk about African American. We're here too, people are like, is it a single set? Is it a particular matrix of culture you're talking about? Or what, when you talk about African American, who is the person that you're raising as the typical African American? We already have issues about that, about the negative stereotypes. So I will be cautious about that Afropolitan identity and what exactly, to what extent it can really speak and capture the complexities of people's identities out there.
Mm-hmm. Well, obviously, again, we just don't even have enough the time really to unpack all of the different levels and ways of seeing this experience. So I thank you so very much, each one of the panelists, for participating. Onoso, Victor, Ifrah, Denique. Thank you on behalf of the Africa Center. Thank you to Lupita Nyong'o for hosting us today as a board member of the Africa Center. This conversation is the type of discussion and the type of questions that the Africa Center wants to continue to have and raise, and they plan to do many more next year. I think that some people are asking for contact information. If that is available there, I think on the website at the Africa Center, there will probably be a link. I think we can also share email and social handles as well. So Ifrah and Denique, or anybody who wants to share, I think those things will be located on the Africa Center's website at the event page, and also the Africa Center will send them to you along with those resources that we've spoken about. Thank you guys so much. There are so many wonderful questions. Unfortunately, we can't get to all of them. We want to acknowledge the participation, those who are participating in the polls. Again, just want to reiterate, these are the type of programs that the Africa Center is planning to continue to do in the new year, which is just around the corner, if we can believe it. We've survived 2020, and we're thankful for that. They have just sent the second poll to you. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to report those results, but again, do you agree? Oh, here it is. Do you agree that this program was informative, engaging, and thought-provoking? Internal polls, just so that people know, so that they know the type of programs that you would like to see more of at the Africa Center. We, again, appreciate your time. We are so grateful. I'll just say on a personal note, and as somebody who is not an employee at the Africa Center, but somebody who's had the good fortune of collaborating with them over the last few years that they've been, back in the mix at New York. I'm really grateful for the space that they continue to hold for these types of conversations and just the cultural, social, political experience of African people. So thank you to the Africa Center. Thank you to, again, these wonderful panelists and everybody who's here today. We wish you a beautiful end of your year. Be healthy, be safe, and move forward in pride.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thanks,
very much.
everyone.
Thank you,
Bye,
Somi.
everybody.
This
Thank
was
you.
wonderful. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
It was so nice to meet everyone.
Same here, Ifrah. Bye.